Hello, and welcome to this lecture. I'm about to give you the sauce, bro. I'm about to give you some wizardry. Not really. It's more so basic stuff. And if you so happen to find yourself entering a new data center job, if you understand every concept that I can illustrate, or at least try to illustrate in this lecture, dude, you're going to be so ahead of the curve. It won't be foreign, crazy wizard magic to you. You can kind of pick up the pieces along the way. I would like to say that this is a layman's guide. It's not that advanced. It's like level 1 to 2 thinking. Like a network for scale, a network engineer would be like maybe a level 10 or 15 in terms of thinking. So this is very basic stuff. If you want a in-depth background on all the nitty-gritty ones and zeros, please go watch Tech Savvy Productions video Beam Me Up, unveiling the speed and technology of fiber and data centers for some proper context. I'm making this for multiple reasons. One, to help other people within my tech Discord that are learning about this kind of stuff. Two, I'm also studying for my my CompTIA Net Plus currently, and I feel like one of the best ways to really cement knowledge in your head is to teach. So I hope you have your pen and paper and would like to take some notes. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments. I love going back and forth with people and being dynamic, and also pop in the Discord and chat. We're always there having occasional chats. So let's see here. Slide 2. Yeah, let's define some terms. Switch. Sometimes in ticketing systems, you'll see it be, designated as a device. And don't worry, these bullet points will have their own individual slides. We're also going to say words like fiber. We're going to say terms like optic or transceiver, and sometimes they even call that a device, so it can kind of get confusing. But if you ever hear the word optic and transceiver, it's the same thing. And yes, this is where we get the term fiber optics from. There's a silent hyphen there. We're going to be talking about patch panels. What we're not going to be talking about is line cards, because it adds a layer of complexity to this lecture that I will not be going into. Line cards, just for the side note, right? Don't register this in your head. Don't go into it. Learn it on the side. Pause the video. Go ahead if you want to really get into it. But if you're brand into this, I say don't bother. Understanding a switch as a switch and not a switch as a collection of line cards is so much simpler to encapsulate, and honestly that's how I started, right? But if you just a quick blurb, line cards are kind of like mini switches, or in a way they're like a mega port with multiple sub ports on it. Does that sound weird? Absolutely, it is weird, and I'm learning it currently, and reading the nomenclature on certain tickets and issues, and realizing that okay, that's actually line card 8 and not like line card 7, or is so annoying, and I don't want to bother complicating this lecture even more by going into line cards. Okay, let's talk about a switch, right? Now, what and why, if you really want to go really into it, talking about different manufacturers and different use cases and bandwidth, that's way too advanced for this lecture. It doesn't really matter. You can work, and maybe it's a first-hand account, but you can work in a data center and not know what the hell a switch really is in its entirety. So I'm going to spare you the effort, but you can just encapsulate this as an idea. Or if you're going to encapsulate the switch as an idea, it just aggregates, right? I'm going to use that word aggregate. Just consider that as like a combine data and routes it, right? So if you can think about it like a funnel, that's the best way I've always had that analogy. If you can see my cursor on the top right, you have all these ports which are going to be sent out with just a couple of cables, right? In this case, I like this example, even though we won't be talking about RJ45 copper switches so much as we will fiber. You have all these copper cables that are like 1 gigabit maximums, right? And all they need is just a couple fiber optics to come out of them to then be routed to the broader network. So it's like a whole lot going in and a lot going out, but not as much in terms of cabling and not as much in terms of limitations of medium. For example, you can transfer data easier, farther, and more efficiently with fiber optics than you can with RJ45 copper lines. Which is why if you take a backhoe and not call before you dig, you're more likely to hit fiber optics than you will RJ45 copper. That happens more often than it really should. Switches have ports on them, right? If you can consider a port to be like a docking station and the switch is a dock, like, you know, there's an individual area that you tie a boat to or something, and those ports have connections, right? Now, issue tickets arise when the connection is either not optimal or it's not even up, right? It could be a broad cascade of reasons that I'll go into, but and I wrote lab environment trauma because up doesn't always mean up. There's really, and this is getting into the weeds of it, but there's actually two types of up, right? There's the physical connection of up, and then there's the administrator side of up, which goes into switch configuration, which again gets pretty fucking in the weeds and complicated. That's like net engineer stuff, right? Switches are smart in the sense that they can actually run an operating system. So switches in a way are kind of their own computer. They have their own, some of them have their own RAM, their own onboard memory, their own processors, and their own storage media, right? Like most of the time, especially these days, they have an M.2 SSD that run their operating system. And why we care is because of the fact that a lot of these OSs, whether it's Cisco or some sort of home lab OS or some sort of flavor of Linux, has various utilities that we can use for troubleshooting, right? So we can run commands if we were to SSH or directly connect into the command line of the switch, either through I didn't include the ubcon system, which is a whole slew of things, but you can actually think of it as like a direct connection. There's two ways you can do this, right? You can do a direct connection with a PuTTY cable or some sort of serial to USB cable, or you can do it virtually and quote-unquote wirelessly, but that depends on if you're running certain utilities at your data center and if you can remotely SSH. That's a whole slew of things. Like they call it an out-of-bounds console system, and how that technology first developed, it's switches serving switches or whatever. Anyway, regardless, the point is, if you can get to the command line however way you can with this within a switch, you can run various commands to help you analyze what's going on, right? So typically you'll get a ticket for a specific port connection and it's not making a proper connection to another port on another switch, and you can log into each of those switches and run various commands to pull data and see what's going on. And sometimes on certain switches you can actually turn that port off and turn it back on again instead of turning off the whole machine. But that's a whole slew of things. Here's a side note, and I think I mentioned this a little bit. I feel like for someone who's just getting into this, I kind of have to make this point. Switches are most likely a middle point in a network than they are the end of a network, right? So if you think of like a web server, you have a server owned by Google or YouTube that is hosting data for youtube.com that is then routed into a switch and then eventually goes into the amazing technology that is the internet, and then goes into another switch that eventually gets to you, the client, pulling data from the web server at youtube.com, right? But the switch itself is not a client, right? The switch is just a router. It's like a conductor of a train. It's not Philadelphia. It's not the end destination of the train. It's someone that helps the train get there, right? It directs traffic, it aggregates traffic, etc., etc. Well, actually, hold on. Now we're really nerding out. Some switches can. Some switches are really smart. Some switches are routers and can do that. but most switches are kind of dumb in a sense that all they do is aggregate data and just point it in the direction that they're configured to. Anyway, and I have a bullet point here in terms of aggregation. Like typically in a data center, what you'll see is like a whole bunch of data, a whole bunch of servers, about maybe 40, 48, or 30, or however many, will process a whole bunch of data, right? And all that data just gets squeezed, packed, and then put into 1 to 3 what they call top of rack switches. They're not always physically on the top of the rack, but that's what they call it, right? Like rack mounted switches that then aggregate the data into a couple of fiber connections into one giant beefy aggregate switch that can handle the bandwidth of multiple hundreds of racks. Well, actually not hundreds of racks, maybe like, dozens of racks, right? And it just goes on from there and there and there. And eventually at some point at the end of a data center is just a bundle of fiber optic cables, and then that's the internet, and just goes to another data center and then eventually goes to end clients, et cetera, et cetera. I want to point this out because if you're ever working on networking tickets, you can kind of get the impression that there's a connection issue between endpoint 1 and endpoint 2, and they're both switches, and sometimes that can give you the misconception that that's it. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing beyond those switches, but in the big grand scheme of things, there always is. But anyway, side note, really nerdy, stupid. You don't have to fully encapsulate encapsulate that. Anyway, fiber. Let's talk about the medium of transporting the medium of transportation for the data, right? So you have your endpoints, which are, and I just said they weren't endpoints, but in the realm of networking, the switches are the endpoints, right? Like for your ticket, right? Port A is here, and then port B is there on switch A and switch B, right? How do they connect? Well, they connect through fiber optics, or they connect to fiber, right? But there's optics at the end of them that actually transceive or translate light data into digital data, right? The switch in itself only reads digital data, but there's a optic, and I'm gonna spoil. I don't know if, wow, I can't believe I didn't do an optics slide. Or I do mention optics, but optics themselves are a sort of device that you mount onto the end of a fiber, right? And the entire job of the optic is to translate light data into digital data that the switch can then read, right? If you ever study for Net Plus or A Plus, and you hear SC connectors, it's very old, archaeotech, legacy stuff. I don't think I've ever seen an SC connector, and the only time I've ever seen the end of an SC connector is for a VFL, which is a tool that you use to make sure that you don't completely lose light on the other end. Anyway, it's like a diagnostic tool. I haven't seen SC connectors, but you do need to know about it for certifications that it exists. What you're going to see in the field more than anything is LC connectors. And MPOs, which is the next slide, right? They get dirty. The ends of them really get dirty. That can result in suboptimal connections, which we'll talk about soon. But yeah, okay. So MPOs are funky looking, right? Whereas in LC and SC fiber, you kind of have this glass core that can get dirty. An MPO kind of has metal pins that connect to the fiber optic, and these can get dirty too, but most of the time it's the inside of the optic that gets dirty as well. Specialized optics are used for this, so the optics you use for an MPO connector you cannot use for a LC or SC fiber optic connector. They're really cool when you see them because that means you don't necessarily have to route. Sometimes what you'll have is a optic that has a fixed from factory fused piece of fiber on the end of it, right? It's so annoying because what you're gonna have to do if you have to replace the optic is run a new line of fiber to the patch panel that it's next to, or however far away it is, whether it's on the top of the rack or right next to the rack or far away from the rack. And it can be very cumbersome of a process when in reality you didn't really need to change the fiber, you just need to change the fiber optic device, transceiver, not the switch, but the device and transceiver, the optic itself, and not the fiber. It can get annoying, and MPOs are really cool because if you have an entire area deployed with MPOs and you have to replace the optic because the optics can go bad a lot, you don't have to reroute fiber. One side note on optics, these things get hot. They process a lot of data, and you'll run into a lot of instances where the optic just goes bad, just goes kaput. It's not, it's not recoverable. You do everything, you reseed it, you do all this other stuff, and it just won't work. And there's telltale signs when an optic just what's the term? Goes brain dead. Whatever you want to say, just becomes internally faulty. And we'll discuss that later when we're talking about light levels. But these are MPO connectors. So MPO connectors are really cool. You see them a lot. And LC connectors, these ones right here with the double and the really thin ones, you see a lot. The really thin ones. SC connectors, you don't see as much. Okay, transmission. Now I'm gonna have to take a sip of water here. Okay, transmission is like, don't read the bottom part. Just follow with me on the bullets, please, before it gets confusing. Okay. On like a ticket or an issue for a networking problem, you'll see terms like TX or RX, or if you SSH into a switch and say, hey, show me the results of data for this port, right? Like port 1. It'll give you certain values in TX and RX, right? Now, T and R represent transmission and reception. Now, especially for something like an LC connector, one end is transmission, the other end is reception. Now, it's not always important to know which is which unless you want to change the polarity of it. And you can do that for various reasons. It's very rare, but I've seen it happen, right? But the point is, light comes in, light goes out. The optic sends out light on one path, and the optic gets light on another path. And that's to prevent collision, because if you sent light on both paths, well, you just step over each other's foot. But in reality, on certain tickets, if they give you a value like this, TX -1, RX -4, what they're really talking about is dB, measured light loss, right? So let's say an optic sends out, 100% of its light, which it always does with every data transmission. What this here is representing is how much loss it is, and there's only a certain amount of loss that's acceptable. I have a slide here that explains that you want to be as close to 0 light loss as possible, right? But it's kind of weird, the negative number kind of like throws it in your head, and it's always like expressed in TX and RX when it really should be expressed like this: transmission light loss and reception light loss. But they never write it like this. I wish they did. I wish it became a standard to write it like this, because it's more clear, to be honest with you. But they write it like this: TX and RX. So if you see TX and RX written this way, it's not transmission equals a -1. It's the light loss of transmission and the light loss of reception, right? And understanding which is which and what this means versus what that means. Like if you have a really high reception light loss and a really low transmission light loss, it may or may not be the side of the network that you're currently working on that's the problem. And being able to determine that, which will come later, is very important. So kind of confusing, but you'll get it, trust me. So attenuation, like what is that? Well, attenuation is just the idea of loss of power over a natural distance. For example, there is an attenuation to everything. There's an attenuation to RJ45 copper cables. You can only have one that's so long before it completely loses its signal, right? Fiber optics is the same way, but it has a really long attenuation curve where you can actually transmit data for pretty far distances without having it to repeat, and it's still strong, right? But the concept of forced attenuation is exactly what this is. It's light loss. Oops, it's light loss, right? So if you ever hear the word attenuation or light loss, just think like it's not getting everything that it needs. It's not getting all the light that it expects and needs to have adequate data transmission. Okay, so if you have light loss, sometimes what you need to do is clean the ports, the fiber ends, replace the fiber, various simple things. Maybe you should reseat the optic, like different tips and tricks that we'll go into later that can help with that. If you have broken fiber, kinks in the fiber, invisible damage in the fiber, it can cause you to have loss of light issues. And there's also one thing, and this is something that I learned from my trainer day one. There is a maximum. Is it maximum radius? Yes, that's right. Or no, hold on. That's the wrong word, isn't it? There is a minimum radius that you can bend a strand of fiber to and still be okay to deploy, right? I think his rule of thumb was if you see fiber come in the mail for us to deploy and it's tight, it's wound tighter than a can of soup or wound tighter than a soda can, don't bother doing it, because all of the fiberglass that's inside of it has now kind of fractured within itself, and it's just going to have a whole lot of resistance to the light that's trying to be transmitted. Okay, so let's talk light levels, right? The more negative, if that makes sense, the worse it gets, right? The closer to 0, the better, right? If you have a ticket, and typically you won't even see light levels like this, because like a ticket will cut for one that, like the switch won't cut a ticket if you have light levels on its optics or light levels on its connections that are between 0 and -3. Most of the time, like, this is acceptable. It's like, okay, well, you have a little bit of light loss, but it's not that bad, right? Where you mostly see tickets are in the -4 to 10 range, and it's usually just caused by dirty fiber. Like, you go and clean the side that is displaying -10, and most of the time it'll get clean, it'll go back to a 10 to 3, maybe you replace the fiber for it, you reseat it, etc., etc. There's different steps for it that I'll go into more in the following slides. The worst one to deal with is something that's like a -15 plus light level, and you'll mostly see it as like a -30 or -40. This means that there's something seriously like crazy going on, and sometimes you get lucky and all you need to do is reseat the optic. Now, how do I read the light levels? You can query or send commands to the switch and the port that you're trying to analyze, and sometimes you are in a network that actually has web tools that communicate with all the switches in the fleet, and you can just specify the host name, the serial, the ASCII tag of it, and you'll be able to run certain commands over the net. This really helps if you're like, okay, why don't you just give everyone that would ever have to deal with this SSH permissions? Well, there's a security factor to it, but it's also an issue of speed. A lot of people who use certain things like web tools would be like teams that not only maintain and fix issues, but also teams that deploy the fabric into the data center in the first place, so that way they can do quick checks and know that everything is hunky-dory before they move on with the next project. So here's a recovery tip for -4 and 10 that I saw that really helped me. One, like, this is the core mentality. You want to show up to that port or that switch physically as little as possible, because time is not on your side. You have other stuff that you need to do. So what I do is I reseat and clean the fiber. I reseat the optic and fiber. I clean the optic, the port, the fiber, whether it's on the switch or the patch panel, and we'll talk about patch panels soon. All at the same time. Okay, and then I analyze. I analyze whether I use SSH or web tools, and if that doesn't work, then I can go on to considering the idea that maybe I have bad fiber somewhere or a bad optic, and going to swap it. The steps beyond this are pretty. They're a lot, but at some point you will find resolution between if you have these light levels, right? That's what I've seen at least. If you have one of these, if you have a -30, -40, dude, it can be so much. It can be a lot of things. It can be a bad port on the switch itself. It can be, something as simple as a reseat and clean of everything listed in the previous slide. You could temporarily swap the optic and see if it comes up, analyze it. It could be a lot of things: bad fiber, bad port, bad switch, bad line card, bad configuration on the switch. It can be so much, and this is where the fun is. This is where you really start to put on your detective hat and learn and figure out, okay, maybe if I try this, maybe if I try that. One thing that I should have done more often was use loopbacks, right? Because I'm now realizing how convenient they really are. Because if you just have the ability to test or run a loopback test, whether you have a web tool or you direct connect into the switch and run it on the optic, you can tell whether or not the optic is bad or whether or not the port is bad, if that's ever going to come up, etc., etc. Like a loopback tool is very important, and of course a loopback tool is dependent on the type of connection that you're going to plug into either the patch panel, the fiber, or the optic itself, right? So these are two male LC connectors that would go into an optic or go into one side of a patch panel, right? This is a male MPO connector. But one thing I didn't list in this picture is a female LC loopback connector, which I've seen where someone puts one of these male ones on the optic and puts a female one on the fiber, and that way they can test both at the same time. Genius, honestly, very genius move, and I wish I learned it earlier. So patch panels are very simple in design, right? This picture below will really help, right? So we've already established that most connections are between two switches, right? That's not what they are in full, but in terms of our issue in networking, that's what they are. You have A and B. You have the the A side and the Z side. I've also seen it be called the near side and the far side, which is so confusing. I hate using that term. But what I want to talk about here are the patch panels. And the patch panels are these blue walls that this yellow fiber here is going through, right? What patch panels do is segment the network physically. I'm not talking about things like VLANs. And the beauty of this is the fact that if you're going to have a break in the fiber, or if you're going to have a issue with the fiber, it's more than likely going to be on the short side. So the short side is fiber that connects from a switch to the patch panel. That's it. And then its corresponding port on the other side of the patch panel goes into a long fiber line, right? Now this long fiber can transcend buildings, can transcend rooms and computer rooms and data halls, or it could be in the same data hall, or it could just be 5 feet away. You never know. But the point is, if you had one giant piece of fiber and you had a cut on the short end, or a nick or a bend on the short end during installation or the maintenance of a switch that's completely unrelated to our network here, maybe this guy was working on one below it or something like that, and or something happened, right? And you have a nick here, you're gonna have to replace the entirety of that span, and it's completely unnecessary. It's completely unnecessary to mess with the long fiber, and typically the long fiber is going to be in a basket above the servers, right? It's a hassle to trace, it's a hassle to mess around with, And a segmented network is a happy network. A network with patch panels is one that's pretty easy to diagnose, right? Let's see here. Is there anything else on the slide before I go into normal architecture? Okay, now in a couple slides, some of you that this is intended for are going to stop watching, and I want you to stop watching because a lot of people don't need to deal with QSFPs, but if you do, stick around. Normal architecture, very simple. You know, we see this. It's going from switch port 1, switch 1, port 1, switch 2, port 2. Now, obviously, switch 1, port 1 can be connected to any other port on switch 2, right? It could be connected to switch 2, port 3, or port 10. Who cares, right? But I just did one-to-one to simplify it, right? Now, when you see it written down, it can be expressed like this. Why I wrote it twice for a reason. I don't know why, but let's delete it. Anyway, it can be expressed like this. Now, more realistically, on a ticket or some sort of you know, printout of a network map, you're going to actually have the full name of the switch, and the full name of the switch is the switch's designation within the network, right? It's not always in this format. You know, different places have different formats for their switch names. But typically what's going to happen is it's going to be, you know, the sub name for the device or the switch, right? The domain that it belongs to, or the certain subsection of the internal internet that it belongs to, and the port that we're talking about, which in this case is port 1. Now you notice how this is represented by the term ETH, right? I think that's just a term that they use to call any port, regardless if we're talking about fiber or, you know, RJ45 Ethernet switches. But as I've listed here on the top right, this dynamic here is almost exactly how you'll see RJ45 switches used for console and management and how they're routed. That's pretty much how it goes. If you go to a small home office or anything like that, or a office environment, they have a switch, a patch panel, and then it goes into some sort of distribution block, or maybe another switch or an end client. You never know. The patch panels are very important because then you don't have to reroute long ass fiber. Anyway, I've said this already, but this is what you're probably going to see, right? This is in normal architecture. You got two short ends on switch 2 side, on switch 1 side, and a long fiber. Now it matters when you're doing isolation testing, because if you feel like you have a break in the fiber, or if you feel like you need to clean fiber, or if you feel like you need to put a loopback on, and I didn't mention this in the loopback section, but if you feel like you have to put a loopback on a section of fiber, so that way you can see whether or not the signal is actually working on that section, you have to be very vigilant on not only how you put the loopback on the patch panels, right, or on the switches directly, but where you send the command to run the loopback, because sometimes you'll make the mistake, and I've made the mistake, where you will log into, well, you'll put the loopback on switch 2, right, and you want to run the loopback command on switch 2, but you're logged into switch 1, and then run that command on switch 1 and get errors or get information that is completely going to throw you off during your investigation. You get lost in the weeds. So if you're going to conduct a loopback test, make sure that you know which side of the network that you're running it on. And you know, certain web tools make it really easy, and some web tools are smart enough to most switches are actually smart enough to know when they're getting loopbacked on, right? They were like, oh wow, this is the exact same data with 0 loss that I've just sent 5 seconds ago. Obviously I'm being loopbacked on, right? And some web tools will actually tell you, hey, press this button to do a loopback, or do this to do a loopback. Where it matters, and there's a certain web tool in mind, especially when we come to talk about QSFPs, if you don't choose the right what do we want to call this? The right pigtail, or the right subgroup, or the right connection point on your network map or web tool, you're gonna wait for a loopback test to run on something that doesn't even have a loopback on it. So please be vigilant when we're talking about loopbacks. What's the next slide here? Okay, look. If you don't have to deal with QSFPs, it's cool to know. It's cool to learn. If you're curious, great. You'll run into it. To be honest with you, I have been freed of this monstrosity, but there are people out there, and I pray for them every day, that have to deal with these a lot. And but if you don't and you don't care, please stop watching here. I hope you have a great day. I'm glad you learned something. But if you do deal with QSFPs and you want a quick rundown on how they work or how to think about them, continue watching. Okay, so far we've expressed connections as from one point to another point, right? Simple, one wire, boom, done. Okay, now what if we did that times 4? Huh? What? Some connections are splits into fourths for reasons. Yeah, it can get really hectic, especially when it comes to the nomenclature of QSFPs. But look, let's digest it. Okay, they're crazy. Let's digest it. If you have a QSFP, you have your switch. You have an optic here that I have not documented, but it's connected to a port 1, right? A single strand of fiber comes out of that optic and then splits into fourths. Okay, cool. You're with me now. Each of those fourths has a port on the patch panel. Okay, cool. But each of those ports, or each of those fourths, sorry, each of those 4 strands, the fourths, has its own designation, right? So this is switch 1, port 1, -4, because it's the 4th one, -3, -2, -1. And each one has its own long fiber run, and it's mirrored on the other side. So here we have switch 1, port 1 connected to switch 1, port 1. What? Oh my god, dude. I'm sorry. This is supposed to be a 2. Yeah, I even had it here. Let me see if I can fix that, actually. Switch 1, port 1. Let's take this. The production value. You get what you pay for. Make this, oh my god, did I do it on the wrong one? Okay. Alright. And here we are. Okay. We have switch 1, port 1, splits into fourths, connecting to each of the fourths of switch 2, port 1, right? Now, I have these labeled, but I don't have them labeled here. But this entire line is not switch 1, port 1, -4. It's switch 1, port 1, -4 connected to switch 2, port 1, -4, right? So imagine if I had them labeled here, okay? I feel like if I put too much text, it would get kind of confusing, so I'm going to put that designation, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Okay, that's pretty much the essence of QSFPs. You have one port on a switch turned into 4 subports, right? And meet 4 other subports that then coagulate or aggregate into one optic on one switch. That's it. That's all it is. Okay. Now let's go into the details. I hope you're not confused. The nomenclature can obviously get confusing. Yes, individual links of the fourths can fail, right? So sometimes you'll get a ticket. Let's go back here, where the light levels between switch 1, port 1, -1 and switch 2, port 1, -1 are good. This one's good too. This one's good too. But this guy, switch 1, port 1, -4 and switch 2, port 1, -4 are bad, right? Like they get a -40. Maybe someone unplugged them, you know? Maybe, I don't know, maybe the fabric is bad, the fiber's bad. Where? Which side? I don't know. Let's see. Let's start throwing fiber at it or whatever. Maybe the optic's bad, and you have to figure it out. And here's the thing: you might say, well, like, you're telling me that a ticket will cut just because of this one bad connection? Yes. And it won't pass or fully close either until all 4 of these connections are good, right? That's the idea of redundancy. Is that, like, yeah, it could work with a 3, but we want all 4, right? And sometimes it's not just because of a redundancy factor, right? Sometimes you need it for bandwidth support. Sometimes you have like a 400 gigabit optic on one side and a whole bunch of 100s that then you might ask yourself, okay, well, you have a whole bunch of 100s. Do they all go to switch 1 port 1? No, they actually go to multi-switch networking, which is crazy. So let's look at the node above. This example is super simple. It's like 1 optic to 1 optic split over fourths for, you know, redundancy or some sort of reason. I don't know. Like maybe they just like more wires in their trays. But no, they're for fault tolerance, redundancy, you know, et cetera, bandwidth support. But this is super simple compared to you know, some realistic layouts where you have a whole bunch of bandwidth that need to go to other switches for, you know, multi-switch networking, more complicated network arrays, et cetera. Sometimes you'll have 1 optic, like switch 2, and that's the common, switch 2 port 1 is the common port. They call it the common port because it's the only port that's going to 1 switch, right? All 4 are going to 4 other switches, and you can kind of imagine that the network can get pretty complicated, or you can kind of imagine that tracking that in each ticket can get pretty complicated. Imagine going to 4 different switches just to fix 1 ticket. Yeah, it can get annoying, right? But that's kind of why QSFP is why QSFP can get kind of annoying to troubleshoot when you have really like freaky stuff going on different ends of the fabric. Anyway, that's all I have for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great one.